Farmland, Atchison, Floodplain, and habitat. So we started as an ornithologist, and I'll let him tell you all his stories, probably a lot more interesting than I am, since he's taught for a long time and he gets to talk very well. So, at any rate, a couple of announcements I want to make. Our next speaker next month will be Casey Whiteman. He's from the Missouri Department of Conservation, and he'll be talking about some more aspects of restoration. But his is shoots. He's done a lot of building shoots, and he'll talk about how those have worked and what they've learned, and I think it changes a lot. So, Doris has brought a book to sell from the Missouri Prairie Foundation. This book is called Bringing Nature Home, and it's written by a professor named Dr. Dept, and he talks about the necessity of plants in the entire food chain. So that if we want birds and animals, we have to start with the basic native plants to get there. They bring back the native insects, and then our native birds eat the native insects. So it's probably the most fundamental thing, one of the most fundamental things we can do to restore a normal habitat is to plant native plants, right? It's full of photos, and he has a lecture that's recorded on YouTube. If you want to hear one of the most interesting lectures you've ever heard, you can go to YouTube and Google Dr. Doug Tammany. So, having said all that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Bowen from Benedictine College, and Dr. Bowen, it's all yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I really like your beginning, and that's "oh, shut up." Rather than "ladies and gentlemen," I'm much more accustomed to beginning my presentations that way. What I'm going to do is I have a talk in 4 different parts, and the beginning will be the development of the bottoms before the Corps became involved, and then what was going on before it became a mitigation site, and the transition to a mitigation site, and then I'll describe some of the research that we did on the site, so you get some ideas about the changes, and then I'll finish describing the parts of the Cottonwood project that are ongoing now. That I began in 2007, and when I retired, Dr. Terry Malloy has continued to work on products. So let me begin with the flood of 1881. The flood of 1881 is the one that put the Rushville Bend in its current configuration. So it moved the river from the Doniphan side over to the Rushville side and created the locations that we have right now. And with that shift, I think that I heard that there were as many as 155 boats and steamboats that were left high and dry in front of the city of Doniphan, and then because the river had moved over about 4 miles. That flood was influential another way because the monks of Benedictine Abbey in Atchison, they initially settled in Doniphan, and when they were left high and dry without a port, that's when they moved to Atchison. So it influenced my life a couple of ways. The flood of 1881 was also interesting in that it established 2 of the 3 positions of Independence Creek. Independence Creek was named Independence Creek by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 when they stopped on July the 4th. And I'll describe the other Independence Creek later. Then after World War II, the Corps of Engineers began actively building levees, and as around the Rushville Bend, which is going to be later called the Benedictine Bottoms. So so I'm referring to it as Rust of Van Early, and then I'll change over here shortly. But Brother Louis from St. Benedict's Abbey burned up 2 bulldozers pushing the cottonwood trees out so that it could become agricultural land. And a lawyer named Duffy was the one that legally acquired land for St. Benedict's Abbey. So this is roughly in the 1950s. When I show up in 1976, the borrow pits for the levees were still visible. And I took the opportunity to hunt mallards and chintails on those borrow pits at that time. They're long since gone. You can't see them anymore. Then, I came into my position at Benedictine College, having done work with prairie birds for the last 6 or 7 years. And so I was very, very interested in the birds. So I initiated a series of censuses and dixisal studies and red-winged blackbird studies on the land that would eventually become the Benedictine Bottoms. So I had been working on the mitigation side for almost 20 years before the Corps of Engineers bought it and adapted it to our mitigation side. Some of the interesting things that we did, actually, some of the most fun I had on that side before it became a mitigation side, it was good corn fields and good soybean fields, and it was very, very attractive to snow geese, which I had been studying for about 10 years. That was during the days when I could go into the ICANN power plant and nobody was afraid that I was there. So, it was just like free range of the plant, and the snow geese overwintered in the fly ash ponds. So I studied snow geese for 10 years. But I was very, very interested in the snow geese. So in my ecology class every 2 years, I would have the students during the snowfalls, during the winter, we'd all dress in white lab coats, and then go down and lie on the ground in the Benedictine Bottoms in some location where the geese would come in. And then the geese would land and feed and come up, really close to you, so it gave the students an opportunity to see the snow geese, but it tickled me that they were in lab coats. I do recall one experience with the snow goose when I had to set the microphone down in order to enact this. I have the white sheet over my head, and I've been lying down still for about a half an hour, and I could hear that the geese were really close. And you could be building my goose. So what I did was, I pulled my sheet out, and then the goose was just as close as we are. And then the goose looked at me like, man, this just doesn't compute. This just doesn't make any sense at all. And then I just lowered myself, and then something else disturbed the geese again. But it was just, the look at that goose's face was memorable. Okay, one of the things I can remember from my early career at Benedictine College that gave me some sense of the river at that time was we had a biology lab where we used kidney tubules from carp. And Father Eugene had gone down to Billy Van Horn for years to get the carp during the time of the year when we needed it for that lab. And Billy Van Horn, who was a third-generation river rat on the river, gave Father Eugene the carp. Well, as a new assistant professor, I was told to go and get the carp. And when I go down to see Billy Van Horn, I don't have near the cachet that a priest had. I couldn't get Billy to heaven. So Billy didn't want to give me the carp. Billy made me buy the carp. I thought fair enough. But, okay, now where's the Missouri River part of this? Here's the Missouri River part. he was an old guy, and he sat in a fishing shack right on the edge of the river, right below the college. And it was common for him to be there with 3 or 4 other philosophers. And they'd be all kicked back, their feet up on the rail, you know, just telling stories. And I would eavesdrop on the stories as much as possible. But the one that I remember best, and the one that I want to tell you is, Billy could recall as a child walking to Omaha from Atchison in the Missouri River, pushing barges, just to give you an idea of how much everything has changed. You know, that just resonated with me. And during those years, we had an overlook from the college down the Missouri River, and I don't recall, maybe for 20 years, ever saying anything good about the Corps of Engineers. You know, I just thought that the barge canal was kind of rude. That's what I thought. Then we go on to Benedictine College goes through an extreme crisis, enrollment crashes, faculty are abandoning the place, and we have a lot of office space. Basically, we're at one point at the college, I think, where every faculty member had his or her own building. I mean, that was kind of the state that we were at. So in order to make the biology department look fluffier to students coming in, I got Roger Wolf of Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks to have his office be on the biology floor at Benedictine College. So I was privileged to hear the development of the Rushville Bend mitigation site, because I knew Roger, I knew Randy Whitaker, I knew Kirk Thompson, and I was seeing these people fairly regularly. They were pretty close now for about a year, but after it became semi-public, the Corps of Engineers was going to begin mitigation and purchase this land. That I became fully informed about what was going to happen. And the way we got involved with the Corps of Engineers is in the biology department, we have 3 really large cold rooms. They were environmental chambers, but we could make them cold rooms. And the Corps of Engineers wanted to begin the mitigation site on the bottoms by planting 175,000 trees. And what they had to do was get the trees in, store them until it was the proper time to plant them. So what we provided at the college was the big coolers. So when they came in with the trees and everything, then I met the people from the Corps of Engineers that were doing the early developmental work like that, Mike Washington's, and later Lynn Covington, discovered what they were up to. And snow research was becoming more and more difficult because they weren't using the land around the college as much, so the students had to travel greater distances in order to do the observations. So that plus the fact that I had a faculty member return from Widener University, and I focused my snow goose project completely. And Dr. Simon and I began a 15-year study of the Benedictine Bottoms from scratch. The Benedictine Bottoms was the first mitigation site established by the Corps of Engineers. It was about 2,000 acres, purchased in 93 and 94. There was about 500 acres of wetlands put in behind stock logs, and about 500 acres of prairie. And we had students who said, let's get started, and I think that we accidentally began the right way, and that was we divided the students into jobs based on taxonomic groups. So we had the mammal person, the bird person, the four-planet tree person, the wild vegetation person. So every student had a specialty so that we could take them to meetings and then they could present the data associated with their specialty. but it also created a workforce for them to collect their data. Everybody could work on everybody else's project. And I think, yeah, I had a couple of times at peak, I had as many as 25 students working on the bottoms, all doing different projects, but supporting each other as they did that. Then, how did the Benedictine Bottoms get its name? It had been Rushville Dam, okay? And Rushville was the Missouri city that the river shifted to from Donovan. So it shifted from the Donovan side to the Rushville side. And it was an appropriate name, but once the Benedictine Bottom was selected as a mitigation site, then it was going to be operated by Kansas. It was going to be a Kansas mitigation site, and I thought I didn't want it to have a Missouri name. So I petitioned the Corps of Engineers to, since the monks had owned the land for 7 years before it became a mitigation site, to name it after the Benedictine Bottoms. And the Corps of Engineers accepted that invitation. I have to admit that I do recall some very, very interesting drawings of the Benedictine Bottoms in those first years, both generated by the Corps of Engineers and then some local Benedictine College students and a variety of people. Use your imagination. So that's how I got started. So the bottoms were purchased in 93 and 94, and 93 was the big flood before 2011. And I remember going on the Benedictine Bottoms after the flood had receded, and my colleague said, "Are we not looking at a cat litter box?" I mean, it was a 2,000-acre cat litter box is what it looked like. Sand and then trees kind of mixed in and tipped over. Then, so the early development occurred. The Corps planted 175,000 trees over the next 4 years in 94, 95, 96, 97, and 98. That's 5 years later. I'm close on these dates. The interesting thing about the early years was that the Benedictine Bottoms was just a spectacular success because it flooded every year. So we had floods, so it always looked just absolutely fabulous. It looked like the wetland that they wanted. That very first year, I remember the bottoms, a set of cattails were colonized by yellow-headed blackbirds, which is pretty unusual in that part of the state. And the other interesting thing about that was that the red-winged blackbirds had driven them out by the end of the breeding season. But to see that dynamic, close to Atchison, Kansas, was really kind of spectacular. Some of the other things that I saw with birds, I was watching, remember it was wetlands in those first 5 years, which it's not really so much anymore. But I was watching a group of yellowlegs around a small kind of mud puddle that was left, and I was looking at them through binoculars, and I had the opportunity to see a peregrine falcon male, one of those yellowlegs, through binoculars as I was watching. So I didn't expect the peregrine falcon. He just showed up kind of in my vision. So early on we had lots of waterfowl, lots of water birds, and their predators. This was really pretty cool. So we had these spectacular floods every single year. Now that was really good for making a wetland. It was really bad for making a planted forest. So most of the 175,000 trees were killed, and that was enormously expensive. And they were doing these sorts of plantings on the Mississippi River. It was what the Corps of Engineers was doing, the mitigation sites at that time. And it was just a series of year after year after year of floods, and all these trees were dying. In '95, I took the opportunity to take 5 of the different, 20 different species were planted that year. I grabbed 5 of them and I planted them in my backyard. So I wanted to just to see if they would be a little bit more successful in an upland. And they were, until I had to put in a new sewer system. But they survived very well up to that point. And there's still a few in my backyard. Kind of impressive trees. So the survival rate in the uplands was much higher than it was in the bottomlands. Okay, some of the studies that we did were on mammals. I have an early expert on the mammal work at Benedictine College, Mike Snyder, was a student. I can tell a little Mike Snyder story. It's okay. He was avid even at the time, and he kind of we were mostly dealing with juniors and seniors, a little bit more sophisticated students, but Mike showed up as a sophomore and just couldn't get rid of him. And so eventually we let him start on the mammal project, and really pretty much independently he did this and did an early presentation at the Kansas Academy of Science, right? Pretty much on your own. I mean, we had been really taking you under a little bit of that. But we did let him on. But he survived and neglected those early years. We studied deer, terrestrial invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, planted trees. I can tell you a planted tree story that's interesting. Because we had prairie, we had to do controlled burns. So we did yearly controlled burns in order to maintain the prairie by eliminating the woody vegetation. And Randy Whitaker liked to burn things, as many of us do. If you work on the prairie, you might set fires. I mean, they're not fun. But okay, so they're doing a controlled burn, and it gets a little windy, and it gets way away from them, and a huge fire went through all the 4 planted trees. So now we had Kansas Dept of Wildlife and Parks, and the Corps of Engineers kind of not too friendly for a while. And I can remember talking to one of the Corps of Engineers, and I asked him, well, what do you think about this? And he just looked at me and he said, arson. So the Corps planted trees had problems other than the plant. There's vegetation, and I kind of was the person, I'm a prairie bird person, but I kind of get stuck with the vegetation studies. I mean, we needed them done, so I supervised them. And in my early training, okay, I grew up in the Golden Ghetto, Johnson County, and I went to Kansas State University to study great prairie chickens, and so I involved in wildlife management. And growing up in Johnson County, I thought wildlife meant rats and blue jays. I mean, I really didn't know that there was anything else. So I had an opportunity to look at the great prairie chickens and get some appreciation of them. But one of the things I did, I was there every morning before first light, you'd sit there, herd chickens would sit on your lawn, and I always tried to imagine what it looked like 200 years ago, 300 years ago. I would spend hours, what did this place look like? Can't look like it does now, at least not too much. And then when I became involved with the vegetation of the Benedictine Bottoms, I was constantly looking at it, trying to wonder where a mitigation should go. I mean, should it go back to the way it was 200 or 300 years ago? That would be a logical place. Not necessarily the only place to go, but a place to go. And because of that, I became captivated by the Lewis and Clark journalists and Lewis and Clark's view, actually Clark's view of what the bottoms look like. So let me read you what Clark thought the Benedictine Bottoms looked like when he was there. We camped in the plain, one of the most beautiful plains I ever saw, open and beautifully diversified with hills and valleys, all presenting themselves to the river, covered with grass and a few scatterings of trees. So he was describing the river bottoms as prairie. And then let me give you another description. When Lewis and Clark wrote the journals, they did, for any particular day, they might do the original description the day that they were there, and then come back to it later, and then even come back after the expedition was over and write about that day one more time. So here's another description. So that, again, this is Clark describing the Benedictine Bottoms. The plains of this country are covered with thick green grass, well calculated for the sweetness and most nourishing hay, interspersed with tops of trees, spreading their lofty branches over pools, springs, and brooks of fine water. Groups of shrubs covered with the most delicious fruit to be seen in every direction, and nature appears to have exerted herself to beautify the scenery by a variety of flowers, delicately and highly flavored, raised above the grass. That's the Benedictine Bottoms 200 years ago. That captured my imagination. Subsequent to that, I covered all of the Lewis and Clark locations 2 times on the Missouri River. So I covered the Lewis and Clark Trail, not on the water yet, at different locations, just to see the river the way they saw it and get some feeling for what the river was like. Some of my impressions about how the early mitigation went are like this. The long-term succession has kind of gone the way you probably should have expected it to go. The first 5 years, tremendous wetlands, beautiful wetlands because of the water. Once the rains quit, then they had a problem, and that was that there wasn't any water on the bottoms, and they had pumps so that they could fill it in. But it turns out that because of all the sand and spits in the bottom, nothing held water. So they have sealed some wetlands, and there's some small wetlands on the bottom that drain sufficiently slowly that it's economically maybe appropriate to fill them up for the duck hunters during the early teal season and during mallard season. But one of the cool things that hadn't occurred to me, because I've never followed succession over a long period of time before, was there was this transition from, the transition was going on from a wetland vegetation to a forest, and I was picking that up in my work there. So I started with yellowlegs and I ended up with woodpeckers. So that the transition was apparent even in that other species that I was observing. I want to finish few minutes with a description of the Cottonwood project in bald eagle, so that when we go into questions, I started the project in 2007, and Dr. Malloy is continuing that, so he can bring you up to speed on what's going on the river beyond where I am. When I lecture with my students, I always said that what I'm going to talk about are two things. One is what's important, that which I think you have to tell, and the other thing I'm going to talk about is stuff that I like to talk about, stuff that's fun for me, you know. So that's the presentation you're getting right now for me. Okay. So I want to talk about a couple of things, and I'm off the topic, not too far, still on the Missouri River. I want to talk about, because I've been thinking about this talk for the last 3 weeks, I kind of came up with what are my 2 favorite places on the Missouri River. And relative to the Lewis and Clark expedition, it certainly is Pompey's Pillar on the Yellowstone River, and then Spirit Mound in South Dakota. And the reason I like those spots the most, and I've dragged Terry out to Spirit Mound before, the reason I like those the most is because that I knew that I was standing where Lewis and Clark had stood. And every place else, the river has wandered around and they couldn't have been there. So I really like those 2 places. And then one of my favorite places on the river, just for its own sake, one of the 2 places, I'll give you 3, like 2 or 3 favorite places. One is Three Rivers, where the Missouri River begins. And I have rocks in my bag that I've carried in my truck from Three Rivers since I lived there, just to see the beginning of the Missouri River. Another favorite place that I have is Great Falls, Montana. Now, if you've been to Great Falls, Montana, it's a tragedy, really, because they have the electric power dams blocking all the cataracts on the Missouri River. So it's really ugly. But you have to look at it with your imagination, which is something I'm capable of doing. And so I was able to see the beautiful cataracts at Great Falls. Now, the irony for these poor people in Great Falls is that they're generating all of this electricity, and they have this horrible view of their falls. You know, there's energy going on them, and they barely trickle, and they're just not attractive at all. And all that electricity is going to California. So they don't even get the benefit of getting ripped off environmentally. Then my second favorite place, I think, is Fort Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth has some of the oldest forests. It's a little bit disturbed by their forester and by the military, but some of the oldest cottonwood forests on the Missouri River, and it's a special place that I've enjoyed going. Okay, and then let me take you to the modern setting, and then I'll open it for questions. Here's the deal on studying cottonwoods for the Corps of Engineers. The Rare and Endangered Species Act protects bald eagles still. And bald eagles need a place to perch. And they have to perch in cottonwood trees. And if you go to Ponca State Park and then go all the way to the mountains, those waterways don't flood regularly anymore because they're controlled by the dams, and cottonwoods are going extinct on that stretch of the river. Then you come down to segment 13, the part of the river that Terry and I study, and cottonwoods are weeds. I mean, you can't get rid of them. They're here in huge numbers. So part of the study of cottonwoods is to understand what the Corps has to do in order to get compliance, in order to support bald eagles. That's the gist for the study. The beauty of something like a bald eagle is that you can drag in all of the other songbirds with it as you do this kind of work. So mitigation that's directed at the bald eagle serves an enormous number of other organisms. And then I suppose I need it in conclusion. Here's my conclusion. How many of you have been to Kansas State Park? If you haven't, you have to go. You don't understand the Missouri River until you stand and look at the point where it's channelized. When you can see the scenic river above it and then the channelized portion below it, then you understand the changes that have occurred in the Missouri River, the necessity for mitigation, and then mitigation itself is a fairly convoluted process. It's never direct, like you sneak the songbirds in and the bald eagles' wings and things like that. Are there any questions?
So, what's the future for Benedictine Bottoms? What do you see it 10 years from now and farther out?
It will have areas that where it continues to flood, where new cottonwood forests will be initiated, and the process will begin again. It has other areas where the cottonwoods are protected from flooding, and they'll become mature. On the lower part of the Missouri River, I don't think I've never seen a completely mature cottonwood forest, and I can't think of any place that I haven't been below Omaha on the Missouri River. The mature cottonwood forests have very few cottonwoods in them. They're very average and other species.
What kind of trees and forest are the survivors?
Well, the 159 survivors. The 159 survivors. If they would have done the plantings like in the years before the flood of 2011, they probably have some trees. They're almost all green ash. Green ash.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. How are the cottonwood trees going to be affected by the climate change? Cottonwoods like extremes. They do. It's a tree for the extremes. It's a tree for the floods, and then it's the tree that hangs on after the floods are gone for a long time. So I think the cottonwoods probably will do reasonably well with the more volatile weather. Terry, what do you think?
I think he hit recruitment. The young trees without water, he hit pretty hard. We were after some recruitment data this summer in areas that had obviously had water that allowed for germination. That long drought really prevented them from being able to make it. And when I see trees this tall, a lot of thousands of them, I go back and in 2 months and they were all dead. So but like Ian says, they're pretty resilient. They can handle these things.
So what lesson did you learn from 175,000 trees being diminished after a
What do we know? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that in the protected cottonwood forest, if we wait 150 years, we'll get those trees. But you can't just put them in. They'll have to come in naturally. But looking at, we'll be,
So the course started with everything they thought should be there without going through the process of rebuilding or
no,
possession?
okay, no, they planted 500 acres of prairie, and that was successful. They put in the stop rocks, and that appeared to be successful because we had all of the rain. And then every year they take a cornfield out and plant it for trees. And early it looked like maybe the trees would do okay, but we had this constant flooding in those early years when they were planting and that killed the trees. I'm not sure that the trees wouldn't have been killed otherwise by the predators. If you have a meal, a tree meal for things that eat trees that's not cottonwood, then it's delicious. And so the mice and rabbits preferentially ring the bark on the oaks and the other trees because they're always on the confidence. So they like the tasty goodies.
Is there any natural regeneration of plants, species that are there for
The plants that were there before the floodplains are always disrupted. So it's disrupted species that occupy the floodplain. So the agricultural disruption is taken care of by the next flood. Then it's just like after any other flood. Got mud, you got silt, you got sand, can't tell an ag field is there for the plants. And then you have, 100, 130 species of plants associated with the cottonwood trees.
If people left alone, so I spent the summer driving from Kansas City to Plattsburgh, and we had remotely sand deposition maps looking for recruitment. Big chunks of area where sand had been deposited, ideal spots for cotton recruitment, and every time I got to one of those spots, they've been dozed. 5 bulldozers out, clearing the field, pushing the sand on it. So, agriculture, people that have the land and they farm it, they reclaim it pretty fast. And so I thought I'd be looking at a lot of cottonwood trees and a lot of seedlings on this sand. The sand was gone by the time I got there.
Is the course still dredging around Benedictine Bottoms? Are they still controlling, putting up levees and maintaining levees and riprap and all that stuff?
I think they're putting in a chute on the bottoms.
To cut the bottoms off?
No, it won't be outside the level. So it'll be a chute that's outside the level. Create fish habitat.
Mike's our chute guy.
See the chute specialist?
I think he's sort of more,
What do you
I
think?
haven't seen the data.
What do you think about chutes?
the goal of the shoots is to explore as part of the mitigation program. There's only a certain amount of shallow water habitat, primarily for the benefit of population. So, and so it's gotten a lot of focus on the mitigation side. So wherever they own something where there's a potential field, they're doing that. So that's why there should be payment opportunity. Like you said, they're looking at building a few chutes like on the outside of that river where the federal levee. So what I think the preliminary results on
do? You just moved.
You get the same, similar composition of species, what's in the main channel, but you're getting the yearling. That's kind of the benefit of the chutes. Shallower waters provide a refuge for the nursery for those fish.
Well, they are all over the bottoms. Yeah, Benedictine Bottoms, that will indicate intensity, thousands and thousands.
So you guys kind of laughed a little bit about the chutes. So why?
It's a big river. These are big projects, and it's hard to collect data on. Ecological data by its nature is a long-term pursuit. So you're talking about the life history of a certain organism. There's not a lot of pallid sturgeon. You don't know a lot about them. Their numbers dropped off before people understood their needs. We destroyed a lot of shallow water habitat. The idea that you go in and you build chutes to create it, there's definite logic to that, to try and restore this. I was up at a chute though, showing wildlife management area in Plattsmouth. That flood filled the whole thing in. You know, you can walk across it, it's all sand. And they're gonna have to dig it back out. You know, so it's, you've got a system that is so heavily engineered, you're rebuilding something, hoping that it works. I mean, I've heard some talks. I haven't looked at the data on the success of it, but it looks like shallow water habitats created. You know, recruitment successful in those areas. Is this going to restore pallid sturgeon?
So the gold standard in health is mortality. And so what about mortality of these guys? Do they live longer? Coming out of the chutes, are there more? Do they live longer? To reproduce?
I don't know. I don't think the data's out.
Do we know? Nobody knows.
There are a lot of stocking efforts, so they're rearing them, they're releasing them in the river. One question would be, are these people using those shallow water habitats? That's hard data to get. I mean, I guess there's some evidence that they are, that they're doing this further up on the river, and you can reduce those recent talks I've seen. But, you know, you gotta wait to see. You talk to farmers though, you know, as I'm driving around this summer, they want to talk plovers, they want to talk sturgeon, and, you know, the conventionalism of this guy that's lived on the river his whole life is those biologists don't know what they're doing. They're looking in the wrong place. I mean, so I don't know, I don't study him. He says he catches them. He says he catches as many now as he did when he was a little kid. So I don't know. I've been on boats with the Missouri Department of Conservation. We catch them. That's kind of shovel nose.
You know, the theory with the sturgeon was we need more shallow water habitat, so they started doing the chutes and create shallow water habitat and cutting some of the dikes. Now they're really centering on we need more sediment, because even if they're spawning in the shallow water habitat, they're not surviving because the predators can see them. And so they need more sediment, because when they're moving, the presentation we had on the sturgeon earlier this year, they're moving downstream. They move the whatever you call the baby fish, caviar, I believe. They move up and down in the water column, and the current carries them downstream. And if they're visible because of the reduction of sediment, so they're more visible to predators as they're moving up and downstream. So that's where the mortality rate comes in. So how are we going to solve the lack of sediment in the river? Will we reduce the amount of sediment by 80%? with the projects we've done in it. We haven't really come up with that. And increasing sediment in a restoration area, you know, you're not getting it in the chutes. I mean, that was one of the big discussions with Jameson Island, was cutting part of the chute and then letting the sediment, letting the river cut the rest of the chute. So the sediment was going in the river, and that was the Clean Water Commission and the Farm Bureau. Well, you won't let us put sediment in the river, why can the court put sediment in the river? Those are good questions, but now research is starting to show that that sediment is, well, why wouldn't it be? You can't just change a system that much and not expect an effect, you know? And then we try and put it back, and it's like talking about the chutes are not, they're not helping the flooding, you know, and they may or may not be helping the habitat. They're all, but at least we're trying. And some of our mistakes are million-dollar mistakes. But some of our successes are multi-million-dollar successes, so.
Yeah, I'd say one thing about the Bottoms, I was one of the first students that worked on it, so Dan taught me, and you know, you got some insight after hearing him as to how he thinks and how he tells stories and how he puts things together. And he's traveled all over the world looking at the Amazon. He just did a 14-day cruise from Amsterdam to Budapest. He's been on a lot of the major rivers of the world, and
One more?
it's the question you asked about what's the future for the Bottoms. I guess at Benedictine College, I'm the new chair of the department. That's in part up to me, and the idea is work with wildlife and parks. As a student, I was doing bird surveys, stepping over furrows and corn stubble before they planted these trees, looking and just beating my head against whatever little brown sparrow bird flew in front of me. What we see now, there are chorus frogs down there, there are mink down there, there are long-eared owls that use the habitat. So if you talk about has it been a success, it's not agriculture, and a lot of organisms are using it. There's indigo bunnies down there. There are a lot of different organisms using the area. Our students are down there all the time. I do a natural history of vertebrates course, and yeah, we sing that old channel, and we're looking at a lot of Asian carp that we're catching chorus frogs, and we're looking at the ephemeral pools and looking at the invertebrates popping up in those. So it's a step forward for better, right? If all of this was lost, and you're talking restoration, there's a lot living there now that wasn't before. It's a step. These talks can often, the Missouri it always goes, it's always kind of jaded. I mean, in one sense, a lot has changed, and there's a lot of good things that happen. Let's go that.
It sounds pretty rich in terms of biodiversity compared
to what I was walking across when I was 20 years old.
But compared to a river that's free,
Oh.
a river that can poop around,
Sure.
we gain something and we lose something. We really have to manage, I guess. So unless portions of us become nomadic, unless we get somebody in architecture excited about little cities, I think we're stuck with this static city model. And it's really amazing what you've done.
If you look ahead at Benedictine Bottoms, you've got this evolutionary process going on with dynamics and changes and that. What would that be? What would that process be?
Well, there's a lot of it they want to continue to keep very immaterial. They want to renew the wetlands every year. They want to renew the quarries every year. And a flooding will probably create new cottonwood forests. And some of the cottonwood forests will mature. They will become true in 150 years.
Not in our life.
No,
And we shouldn't expect, or should we?
no, you never should. I mean, when I first stood and looking at the mitigation side, I knew that I would only see 20 years in a process that would take 20 years.
Are there brine shrimp?
There are, I mean, you hit these pools at certain, the fairy shrimp and, those ephemeral species. You catch those at the right time, and it's spectacular. You look at this and students think they're looking at aliens or something. It's just, where did they come from? The idea that there wasn't water there, and then bam, they explode. It's fun.
Wait, that's an egg, isn't it? I mean, isn't that a food crop? I mean, are we having some economics here? Isn't that a possibility?
Yeah, these are little guys. Yeah,
Little guy.
yeah.
Any other questions?
I'd kind of like to know what you would do with Benedictine Bottoms and wanted to take it to the next natural step. What would you do?
So you walk to the bank. Okay, you walk up to the bank and you look down at the water. You're looking down 20 feet. How restoring that to a wetland, the idea of getting the water up there to, make it. I think it's come a long way. I mean, like Dan said, maybe you'll get a section of trees that stick around long enough to mature. This last flood wiped the outside of the levee clean. It looked like a bomb going off. What was there this summer was all annual sunflower. Japanese hops was covering it. I mean, you could barely walk across. It's pretty depressing. But those floods are going to keep coming. They'll wipe it clean. The outside, you're probably talking about that inside. And periodically when that water gets in there and it sets up some sand. I suspect wildlife and parks will manage it for, hunting. Deer use it, turkey use it, pheasant use it. Personally, philosophically, what I would do, leave alone. Walk away from it, leave alone. But
Well, yeah, but you brought up the invasives and the Japanese hops. Floods bring those.
yeah, they're there.
That hops is there any plan to do anything with it? I mean, I've had it destroy my projects. We cleared everything out to get it ready for planting, and
It's just nasty.
And it just took over everything. I mean, we tried seeding, and then we tried plugs, we removed it, and it just this. I mean, you put a piece of tape on it, and you go back in 2 weeks, and it's grown this far. And that's just one piece of the vine.
In weed science, they talk about solutions by connecting saving cells by time or vegetable. Yes.
The worst, the nasty.
Yeah, it's chromatograph to the plant and connecting a polygraph to the investigating scientist.
Yes, probably they are all.
We wanted to visit the bottoms. Is there a hike with a canoe kayak? Where? Yeah, where would you go? Where would you?
It's open to the public.
So like, okay, so you just,
Yeah, you just, go out, drive in, and, you could walk, all of the interior roads, but you could also walk, over the levee, you could go out to the river, or you could walk the entire levee, which is probably 7 miles. So, yeah, maybe opportunities. They only, I don't know, it's closed during some hunting seasons to the public. So, I don't know what's open in Kansas right now. But in February, there's nothing, it's gonna be open February all the way through August. Yes.
So, what's the role of Would it eventually evolve to the point where Dept was not for not to be a problem out there? If you left it alone?
That's a great question. This side
We haven't seen
conversation
that
is,
happen yet.
it doesn't maybe look like that's true, that it may not take care of it.
So you have to control the
Yes. Yes. It's like the bush honeysuckle. Or the Japanese honeysuckle. Yeah, if you know, we've done things to remove it. We've used the pesticide or herbicides. And you can even kill what's there. You can remove what's there. But the seed bank is extremely viable. There's tons and tons of seeds. You know, they say they'll last for 3 years. That's a whole other thing, the issue about what a seed bank is, because, you know, you go out and do it to restore natural area, you cut out all the honeysuckle, and there hadn't been any fire for 100 years, and all of a sudden all these natives are coming up. Well, nobody planted them. They haven't been there for, you know, years, many decades, and yet here they come, right up. So, to tell me that the seed bank is only viable for 3 years, if you burn it, it likes it. In fact, the only thing is poison, and we haven't been able to eradicate it. Basically, we gave up on the project, and it's our lessons learned project. So, you know, if I had to do it again, I would, we'd remove all the fescue, and we'd plant a rye cover crop at the same time, and then we tried to do a prairie planting with 15 different species, but we would only do 2 or 3 that, you know, take over quickly, and then once you catch that established, then you can start adding some diversity. But getting the part established to start with is a big problem. You know, when you're right next to the river. What the project we were doing was actually in a flood control project, and they've got 2 stages of the riverbank, and we were in the basically the lower tier, planting that bench. Every time we planted something, it flood. It's just problem after problem.
The little blue,
Yeah.
that's where they channelized it for instance,
Yeah.
yeah.
We can't last about 15 miles.
Well, I'm gonna take your Benedictine Bottoms to get back to the non-disturbed campus. Would it ever go back to that? No.
Yeah, that's not the nature of it. Floodplain is always disturbed. It's a disturbed habitat. The riparian corridor is protected for, becomes more disturbed, and it's always disturbed.
Not a piece.
I've heard reports of sycamore trees that were old enough, I guess they're over 200 years old, they become hollow inside. I mean, a lot of sycamore trees in some of our neighborhoods are hollowed out by the time they're 100 years old. They've got sections that are hollowed, they're removed in one neighborhood, and you can see the cross sections. And these things were used as cuts, or, you know, the indigenous people would come by and live inside of them when they pass through. And I'm thinking, is it possible that some of these areas are kind of areas that could be maintained and someone could see what a stable, old growth river area would look like, or are they always dynamic? Is it always changing, or they always, I mean, is it better that it's changing? Is it better that it's dynamic and nothing really lives more than 25 a century?
Probably century is max.
It's like a century. Is that the?
Yeah, that's okay. The one thing, I mentioned the height of the bank. The connectivity, the natural connectivity to the river is gone. I mean, so the idea that it will ever be what it was. When it floods and when the river comes up, usually every year, that connectivity returns, but not in the same way that it would have been historic. The shallow water habitat and areas for reproduction, regular, transportation of nutrients that happens with amphibians and reptiles and birds and those kinds of things.
Maybe Benedictine Bottoms is?
That's certainly more state, that's the oldest portion.
So what you're saying is, as long as the Corps of Engineers manages the river for navigation and agriculture, we're never going to have to restore it.
But even now, if we cut all the dams and did no maintenance on it at all, it would never go back to what it was because of the navigation project to start with and all the land that's been created. And so even some of that could be recovered, but generally it would be a totally different river. The been through many different places, and yeah.
That's okay, that's what it always did. I mean, wasn't it a different river every so often?
Well,
In several
I
places?
mean, yeah, sure, they talk about the planet being in danger, but it's not the planet, it's us. I mean, the planet's still gonna be
I think
there.
the planet will be better.
Well, it's like a hose, and when a hose goes a lot of water through it, it's gonna just, swing wildly, but we've got these places like, we don't want this river to swing over Baton Rouge, so we controlled it. So, isn't that the main problem with it ever being stable? A system that's.
Braided channels and connectivity. People like their houses my family's been part of this land for generations, and I wanted, I was talking to a farmer this summer, asking for permission to access recruitment areas. He's been there since he was a little kid, and he's farmed it his whole life. And I've always found that people that live on the landscape understand the resource much better than anybody else. And the wisdom gained from living, fishing it, hunting it, farming it is invaluable. I think those conversations should be more frequent. And that wisdom is a great value to me. I mean, those are the kinds of people I bring in as my students, because a lot of my students don't have connectivity in the landscape. They grew up in cities. Talk to this guy and say, what have you seen change in the last 60 years? And how's it impact your life? Those are valuable conversations.
Anybody else? Is there a question over here? All right.
I don't know if you have any more time, or you can be close to the limit, but I would like to say.
I have no limits.